Greetings, this is Ty Brown, and welcome to the One Question Leadership Podcast, where we highlight executive and organizational leadership. I'm joined today by Dr. Lauren Bullock. Dr. Bullock is a professor at Temple, where she teaches classes in leadership, public relations, and sport media. Greetings, Dr. Bullock. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, how are you today, Ty?
I am happy that you are on, Dr. Bullock. One part of the things you do is you are part of the team at Stretch, right? Stretch, where you are a leadership, communication, and career coach for from what I know,
Yes.
executives in the NFL, people in corporate, other levels of sport across the board. Sometimes I dabble in being a part of that team at Stretch too, so we're very familiar. One thing I want to talk to you about having you on, being a professor, recently finishing the PhD, but you've been teaching for a number of years. Help me out with academia. What did they call you before you were a professor, before you had your PhD? Because you've been teaching for years, right?
Yeah. So I started teaching in 2012. I
Okay.
I remember distinctly I posted on my Facebook in 2009 I wanted to be a professor.
Right.
And I'd never had that dream before. And so I had a mentor who was like, "Are you sure?"
Mm-hmm.
And I said, "Yeah, I definitely am sure." And so for 2 to 3 years I sat in the back of his classroom and just absorbed teaching from him.
Okay.
I only stopped because I got pregnant and couldn't stay up late enough for the evening classes. And so I put that out there and I started teaching. I had my I had a 1 credit course fall 2012. And then I had a faculty member who was running a leadership program offer me an opportunity to teach a 3 credit class in the spring of 2013. And so since then I've been teaching. I usually tell my students to call me Lauren.
Okay.
Most people, when we know each other, usually some kind of nickname comes up like LB or whatever. But I tell my students to call me Lauren because I don't want the privilege and the prestige of the title of doctor or professor to prevent them from having a conversation with me. And so it's something simple. Some of my colleagues are different, but I've always been like, please, to everybody, please call me Lauren until that nickname develops.
Yeah, that's excellent. And that was 2009 when you posted that. Now, up until, help me with the timeline here. You were, I guess, for the lack of a better term now, a sport information director or a collegiate sport communicator until 2012 when you started teaching, or you stayed in sports information through your beginnings in teaching?
Sure. I can kind of walk you through because I've had a little bit of a wonky
Okay.
career. So I went to college and I was a marketing student because I didn't know what I wanted to do. And lovingly, I didn't even really want to go to college. I
Right.
could, I had the grades, I just didn't know what I wanted to do. And so in college, I got into sport management. And when I graduated, I thought I would be a sport, thought I would be an athletic director. And the cool thing is, I had great leaders in college who prepared me to be an SID, sports information director, now retired. There's a joke amongst us that retired that we have an official label, retired SID. So I went to Disney and did sports public relations. And then I was in sports information at Texas and Florida State. But then I knew I couldn't have a family, or at the time I felt like I couldn't have a family and work. So I pivoted into student affairs. And I remember my in the interview process, they were like, "Are you sure you can work the hours of student affairs?" And I just remember thinking, I work 7 days a week from, August 1st to June 30th every year because of my teams. I could do student affairs with no problem. And so I was working in student activities, student affairs for about 10 years. And in my path, I became the director of the leadership programs at our university. And so while I was the director, that's when I got the invitation to teach a part time course. And then I kept saying to the director at the time, that the assistant chair who was scheduling classes, I kept saying, like, I have this public relations background and I have this leadership background because at my institution, the leadership courses are in the public relations
Okay.
curriculum. If you're going to publicize and promote leaders, you have to understand leadership at its core. And so I kept saying I can teach both. And then ironically, 1 year I couldn't adjunct. I had a young child and I was in my PhD program and I was working full time. And I remember saying to the guy, like, if you have a full time job, I can come over here, but I can't adjunct until I'm done with my doctorate.
Right.
And fun fact, he called me one day. It was the week of the Eagles. They were doing their Super Bowl parade.
Oh, wow.
And so I interviewed for my current job the day of the parade. It was me, him, and one other person. Everybody else was at the parade. I'm not a Philadelphia Eagles fan, so I didn't have a problem with it, but I am in the heart of Philadelphia Eagles
Right.
country,
Yeah.
and the 3 of us were on that Zoom and doing the interview, and so kinda that's how I got here, but I had an app I tell everybody at my institution, like, I got 2 more departments before I'm the president because I've been in academic affairs, student affairs, and athletics. I got 2 more departments somewhere before they'll let me be president.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So, in your initial teaching, so understanding what you said, in order to tell the story of a leader or to tell the story of leading an organization, you really have to understand leadership.
Yes.
This is about to be a general question, which asking a professor a general question can lead to 15 minutes of combos, right? This and this and this. But in your education about leadership, do you have any specific theory on what leadership is that you either have developed or you buy into type situation?
So great question. The first thing I'll say is I have a public relations background where we're templated and concise.
Okay.
So
Okay.
I'm
Excellent.
that faculty member. I could, but I would be coaching my clients not to go on
Right.
for 15 minutes.
Yep.
So I don't have a specific theory that I've created. What I do have is a core belief about leadership that comes from a few basic texts. I believe that one, leadership is a process, and two, it's not just about success, but it's about struggle. And I feel like sometimes if we don't feel like we're struggling, we don't feel like we're leading.
Okay.
And in reality, you need both of those. So in my definition, it's about struggle and it's about success. But it's about a process of leading people towards whatever that shared vision or shared outcome is.
That's interesting. And so then when you tie public relations to that, are you focused on those concepts behind leadership to be able to raise awareness or tell a story or correct the narrative that's out there
Yeah.
or tell me about how that ties into the things you just said?
So it feels like leadership and communication they've been together in the background
Right.
and they're just now coming to mainstream. So public relations, they don't even have a definition or a shared theory of what public relation is,
Oh,
same as
wow.
leadership.
Yep.
Storytelling has become more prominent in the last few years, more mainstream, which is part of it. But I feel like a large reason why we have 4 leadership courses, 2 of which are required in our public relations major, is because someone saw the connection between those 2 areas. For me, it feels like public relations actually helps me do a better job as a leader. At our core, it's not just about sensationalizing a story, which is kind of the rap that it gets.
Yeah.
It's about how are we listening to our stakeholders, giving them the information they need on the platform that they need. At our core, every good PR person, that's what we're trying to do. We want likes and we want hits and we want headlines, but ultimately we want to know our stakeholders have the information they need to make a good decision, which business is the same way.
Mhm.
What I love now is there's some creativity in how we tell that story in that space. But I was doing that when I was at Texas and when I was
Right.
at Florida State and even at Disney, I was doing that storytelling about leadership.
Tie that what you said, well, good somebody who understands PR to the um, identifying challenges, process, and the other thing you said about leadership. Tie those together in terms of
Oh,
how,
challenges,
yeah,
success, stakeholders.
yeah.
What a wonderful question. When you said Ty, I was about to say, wait, Ty, you are Ty.
It's hilarious.
S so so I think about it like this. So in my position, I run the sport media major,
Mhm.
and the first year before when we were putting the proposal together, I had this vision of this could be the best program out there, and here's some of the things that are missing in this proposal.
Right.
And so then when they said, "Lauren, you have a lot to say about this. You should come lead this." I felt very much prepared because I taught so many leadership concepts. Among leadership educators, you feel this pull to be a better leader because you're teaching the core concepts. It's like you can't live in mediocrity. You can't live in being a hypocrite. Like you're teaching this, you have to do this. And so when I got that role, one of the really important things I thought about is like what's our vision and what looks really good in this space. But I also knew in higher education, the challenges are going to pop up. They're not going to neatly bring them to your lap. And so you have to be active and understand who your stakeholders are and go kind of pull that information from them because they're not going to come to you with their issues. And I feel like that's something that's universal to any good CEO or athletic director or SWA or any good coach. You almost have to pull the problems out of people.
Yeah.
And so I always say success and challenge because in those challenges can be some of the best moments you have. So, for example, we had a course that wasn't working and it looked good on paper, but when students were going through it, it just didn't match. But it forced us to create an even better, more interesting course that I think students are going to be excited to take in our major and in other parts of the from other parts of the university.
Yeah.
So when I think about leadership, I feel like this position is perfect in that it brings all of that together.
Yeah, so there's this aspect of what you're saying that makes me think about if I am the person in charge of, um, let's say, public relations. Let's couch that, right? For an organization, for a team, with a leader, I probably need to be very well in communication or even at the table with this leader so I understand what the successes are, the challenges are, the processes that they're dealing with, right? And so as I go out and either have to craft a narrative or make sure I tell whatever I need to tell, I am finally in tune with what this coach or what this leader or what this
Yeah.
CEO is dealing with, right?
So in public relations, we teach that, but I'll take it a step further. Oftentimes, CEOs get to that level because, or athletic directors, they get to that level because they know what they're doing and they trust their gut and their instinct.
Yeah.
And so we can offer that insight, but at the end of the day, we also have to plan for whatever they want to do.
Yeah.
So I'll share an example. I had a colleague who works in the NFL, and we were talking one day, and he shared that the coaches were making a decision on when to let someone go. And he had shared, hey, if you let them go at this time, this is the backlash that they're going to face. And they're like, no, 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 we don't think so. So fast forward, they release this person. That backlash that he said happened,
Hmm.
but he's still responsible for that, whether or not he
Yeah.
agrees with the
That's
decision.
true.
So yes, you're right. In a perfect world, we would weigh in and that would be factored into it. But what got the athletic director to or that CEO, that leader to that position, a lot of it was relying on their gut or disagreeing with people or taking a risk when no one else would take the risk. So it becomes a little bit of a challenge in that way. But if you have a good, strong relationship with your communications person, then they'll say it, but you also trust that they've got 4 to 5 plans for whatever happens, especially the stuff they can't
Oh
predict.
yeah, yeah. So as a leader, I need to know whose input I can take to make the decision that I feel like is the best decision.
Yes.
But the person who's in charge of PR probably should listen to that input in addition to the rest of the insight that I have to make that
Yeah.
executive decision. Yeah, I like that. That's excellent.
You can make that argument too for athletic training, for academic advising. You can make that argument for everything, but you just have to be aware that sometimes taking that risk or going against what people said
Mhm.
is what landed a success for them. So when you hear it, you can't take it personally.
Okay.
You But if you've built up enough of those, "Hey, I wouldn't do that," and you have that relationship, then at least you'll consider it and know they have a plan afterwards in case the risk doesn't work.
Right. I understand that. Now, one thing about you I know is that you have a podcast called Leadership Educator Podcast, right?
I do. I do.
And the leadership educator, it's almost an industry in itself. Now,
Mhm.
I don't want you to look at me with the side eye. I consider myself a leadership educator, right? Because I tell the story of leaders and try to couch it in my own philosophy, which is that the role of a leader is to create and maintain an environment that people want to be a part of. And I feel like all the things you said so far fit in there too, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Tell me a little bit about the industry of leadership educator, and then tell me about like I assume there's a bunch of theory and philosophy behind leadership that a bunch of text have put together in academia, and then you being somebody who has been on the practical side, when you teach it, you bring those two things together: practical theory, academia,
Yeah.
all that stuff.
So leadership education, we actually call ourselves a community, just
Okay.
meaning industry feels very capitalistic and money driven. And a lot of our work is very collaborative and appreciating and challenging what exists.
Right.
We don't have like central text, but there are some pretty important buckets that I feel like we regularly talk about. Anyone who teaches or trains is in the leadership education space for us. So if
Okay.
you feel like that's where you live,
I count.
um, my colleague actually wrote a book on the role of the leadership educator, my co-host,
Okay.
how he and I got started. We are Florida State grads, and we kept seeing each other at leadership conferences. And then one day we were sitting at this huge student affairs conference where Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor was presenting, and we kind of looked at each other and was like, this is a big moment, and we're experiencing it together.
Mhm.
Fast forward to like 3 months later, he got a grant, and he said Lauren could do this podcast with me, and he said, "Hey, are you interested?" And I'm like, "Sure." I'd actually done podcasts in my role. I'd done podcasts in my student leadership director role. In this faculty, I knew I could podcast, but I hadn't started one. And so the opportunity kind of landed in my lap at the first time. A lot of it is what conversations are happening in our community and how can we bring those to the space. We recorded one today with, so oftentimes when faculty write journal articles, they kind of live online in that space. And we've had this 6-year partnership now where the people who are writing the journal articles or the co-editors, they're coming on our podcast and talking about not just the content, but the process. So if you've listened to all 20 episodes, you could probably co-edit your own issue of that journal because we're bringing out and drawing out both of those concepts.
Right.
But yeah, so the leadership education space, my understanding, community of practice and scholarship that anybody who feels like they fall into that area can be a part of.
So is it community? Is the community of the type, from what I understand sometimes about academia, where you might get looked at a little bit until you prove your credibility to be in that community? Or is it just, hey man, we believe in what you believe, you're a leadership educator and we're here to help you get better? Like, tell me a little bit about that, because it's tied to academia.
So, it's interesting. I feel like as someone who has worked inside higher education for 20 years and someone who has worked, especially in the last 5 years, 6 years outside of higher education, I feel like there's some stereotypes on both ends.
Okay.
So, for example, we've had people who have not been faculty or scholars come on our podcast and talk. What we usually centered around is what issues or challenges are people facing in our leadership education space. And so, like, we don't promote single books. We're not promoting single topics. It's really about what are the themes that we're seeing, and then how are we using our understanding of pedagogy and andragogy to have these conversations. I feel like, though, like, I know for me, sometimes I'll go in these spaces and people have all these assumptions because I'm faculty. And I'm like, but for 10 years, I wasn't faculty.
Yeah.
And I ran my own department. And I'll share, when I ran the leadership office I ran a leadership office for 6 years. We provided leadership training for any student. At my institution, we had at that time 37,000, of which 10,000 were graduate students, and we have 8 to 9 different campuses. So I had to go out and find students to join our program. And when I inherited the program, we had 400 students and we were only really training student leaders. By the time I left, we were at over 1,500, which was about a percentage of the population, which I felt was good. We were doing almost half as much engagement as our student activities office was. And I was getting students who they were working full time and still wanted training, or they were a mom and they didn't think they would be included in a student org, or they didn't fit the student leader mold. And so I felt like in academia, it felt like a real entrepreneurial space where I could bring in people who maybe didn't see themselves as leaders and connect them in this community. Like, it's funny, one of my students, she just was named deputy commissioner in Boston of open spaces. I've got another 2 students who met at a leadership retreat that I had and got married. And so I say all of that to say, I feel like I understand why those stereotypes exist, but I also feel like there are very much pockets where, like, that the academic stereotypes aren't really a thing.
Yeah.
But I also recognize I live in a bubble too. Like, most of my peers don't have PhDs, and to get hired as a full-time faculty, you don't have to have a PhD in my department. Like, I don't have to do research. I do research because I want to do research.
Right.
And we get measured on what's our graduation percentage and where are they going after they graduate. We don't get measured. I don't, and most of my peers, we don't get measured on scholarship and some of
Yeah,
those traditional things.
yeah, I
So I
like
feel
that.
like sometimes, and I felt this way too. So I'll share with you, when I first got into leadership education, I saw all these big names and I would see them at conferences and I'd be like, oh, I can't talk to them. They're too big. They've published too much. They've done these things. And then I go talk to them and they're saying amazing things. Like we have this woman who's the grandmother of leadership education, and she and I, like, one day for my birthday, we were eating lunch together and she was singing happy birthday to me. And that's not the memory I would have thought I had of her.
Mhm.
I would have thought, she would have thanked me for reading her research or her scholarship. But I feel like sometimes people put those barriers up and they don't always exist in those
Yeah,
spaces.
that's true, 100%. I want to talk about culture a little bit. I've heard you talk on the aspects of culture that a lot of us in the practical world don't necessarily address when we go out and talk about culture. Tell me a little bit about that if you know what I'm referring to. Right.
Yeah, so we've had this conversation where you've heard me get mad because people use the word culture,
Mhm.
and it's like leadership. There's 100 different
Right.
definitions, and I just I remember thinking there are four specific components of culture, and y'all aren't touching on those in a way that makes this more technical for people trying to apply it.
Yep.
So yeah, we've had this discussion off mic, so I guess we can have it now.
Yeah. You're okay
Oh,
with that?
you be setting me up, Ty. No, I'm fine with it. When I was in my doctorate program, about halfway through, I left student affairs and went to the faculty side. And I thought I was going to write about generational characteristics and what Gen Z in college was like.
Yep.
But I remember having this discussion with my advisor, and she said to me, "Are you going back to student affairs?" And at the time, I was like burnt out. I was done with student
Yeah.
affairs. And I'm sure there was an expletive or two in that conversation. I've moved past that, let it go. But it was a very distinct no. And so she was kind of like, well, what can you do? And up until that point, I had done a lot of work around generations. And to me, it felt like, when is it a generational thing? And when is it you have to adjust your culture? So there was that piece. And then one of the lectures that I did in my leading groups and team building class centered on components of culture. And there were two things that I felt like people weren't talking about. So there's four that I talk about. One of them is values. One is unwritten ground rules. One is logos, and then one is systems.
Okay.
And the two I didn't feel like people were talking about enough, ironically, was values and unwritten ground rules.
Okay.
And when I say values, people had values and they were out there, but it was espoused versus enacted, meaning you said you valued inclusion, yet you weren't hiring people of diverse backgrounds,
Mhm.
beyond just race and gender, but you weren't hiring people from different levels of, institutions at the NCAA and
Right.
things like that. And so I felt like there was this preachy talk about values that people were saying, and but they weren't distinguishing between your behavior is going to show your values more than your communication.
Yeah.
And then unwritten ground rules is, we're supposed to do it this way, but this is how we actually do it, and we don't tell the boss. Or
Okay.
this is the problem we have, and we're not going to tell the person who can actually change it because we fear retribution, or we just don't know. And so in the last probably year or two, one of the things I've leaned into is talking about culture and those components and just labeling them, and then kind of overlaying the generational or the age group piece.
Right.
So we have folks who are like in their 50s and 60s, have seen a lot of change in athletics, and they value their experience, whereas some newer folks coming in, they value that experience, but they also are questioning, what do we keep and what do we change? And sometimes they're not talking generationally,
Mhm.
but culturally they could be having that conversation.
Right.
So between those four components and that age overlay, been having some of those
I
conversations.
want to touch on that age overlay and multi-general thing, but I do have a question. Are unwritten ground rules always lean towards negative?
What a great question.
Uh-huh.
You don't pay attention to them when they're positive, and
Okay.
usually if they're positive, you make those statements. You're not ashamed to say it.
Okay.
The negative ones are the ones you have to surface so that you can address them.
Right.
So for example, I gave a presentation and one of the attendees asked me, but no, my culture is great. We do XYZ, we don't have any problems. And, I was like, well, that's wonderful. But my first thought to him was, do they trust you enough to bring the unwritten ground rules, their problems, or
Right.
the things that they don't talk about, but they do to you in that space? You can feel like it, but if you're not really surfacing that, then you want some proof, some evidence versus like claiming it's true
Yeah.
versus evidence.
So let me see if I can repeat those four values, unwritten ground rules, the branding, and the branding. Isn't that what you said? What did you say?
So values, unwritten ground rules, logos, not
Logo.
branding,
Okay.
but I maybe I can tell them to change it.
No, no,
Logos,
no.
branding,
The logos is this is probably me making a tie that may or may not be there. And what was
and
the
then
fourth one?
organizational systems. It's how does communication flow through your organization?
So the question I have for you is one of those four, for the lack of a better word, more weighted? Like if something cancerous or something is growing in one of those four, is one of those more detrimental and you need to attack it immediately
Yeah,
because if this one gets out of hand? You mean can you, it's like
I
four
do.
birds
I know
there,
what
right?
you mean.
Can you exist with three of those and not the fourth one or something like that?
I do. So in what scholarship says
Mhm.
is they're all technically equally weighted.
Okay.
However, unwritten ground rules are probably your biggest challenge. So I think about logos. They're visual and we are visual people. So when you look at an Apple logo or YouTube, you immediately have a set of assumptions based on what they've said and what your experience has been
Okay.
with that organization. Unwritten ground rules, you don't know because nobody is saying it, but you may be seeing the outcomes of those
Oh yeah.
unwritten ground rules. So, for
So that can
example,
fester real quick, right? Yeah.
exactly, exactly. So so I'll say for example, in my program, I had my in my major, I had two different departments having similar challenges. Neither department brought it to me. And that's just kinda, that's just how organizations
Right.
work. And so I happened to be having a conversation with one person. They were like, "Oh, I meant to talk to you about this, blah, 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 blah." And we had this conversation. And so they knew, and I my reputation at the institution has been, if she's responsible for it, she's responsible for it. So if you bring it to her, she'll try to find a solution. But the unwritten ground rule was we just don't see each other. So because I wasn't seeing those people, they weren't really, they had it in their on their mind, but it wasn't top of mind because it wasn't a priority for them. So with the logos, it's visible, it's easy to know if people like your brand or not. With unwritten ground rules, you may think there's nothing wrong, and in reality, it could be festering under the
Yeah.
surface. And until someone brings it to your attention or you go and find it, it's tougher. So I don't think there's a different weighting, but they all can cause problems for
Yeah.
sure.
I mean, that could show up without somebody bringing it to your attention or without you looking for it. It just all of a
Yes.
sudden shows up, and now you realize I've been
Yeah.
building something that's has a bad
Yeah.
foundation or something. Okay, yeah, I think that's excellent.
I'll give you an example. It might be controversial, but it's something I'm looking at in sport media. So we recently know that there was an NFL insider that had a questionable relationship with an NFL head coach. And one of the things I think about is some of the unwritten ground rules were there are some people that are good friends, and this has been said in the national media. There are some people that are good friends with media members, and for the most part, they can separate like their work from their friendship. So I think one of the things that came out was there are some unwritten ground rules around maybe we need to have some more boundaries because in this instance it really caused a big issue.
Mhm.
And so again, until the event happened where it surfaced and showed kind of the broader audience why it was an issue, um, I think it was kind of going on behind the scenes. And there's so many examples of that, but that's
Yeah,
one of those things where it's not the logo that's the problem, it's the unwritten ground rule of how you interact.
yeah. Or people knowing that it's happening and are not, hey, this is people are looking at this. We need to do
Yeah,
something about it.
agreed.
Yeah, you're right about that. That's very interesting. The multi-generational workforce is something that you have given lectures, facilitated workshops on. And the question you just mentioned in terms of like, is this a cultural characteristic? Is it a generational characteristic? Are people blaming it on something that it really isn't type situation? And how do you get people to buy into an organization's culture? Talk to me a little bit about that in terms of what we see, because it is, you got people in their 50s and 60s who are working with people in their late 20s, right?
Yeah.
and we have all different outlooks on things, but it may not even have to do with age. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the main theme of the conversation is you have to get to know the individual. The generational characteristics can give us clues, but there are some people that defy some of those generational characteristics. So for example, the characteristics of someone who is Gen Z, so they're right now at the time of recording in 2026, they're about 46 to 55. They are very skeptical.
Your next.
And
That's your next, right?
oh, I'm sorry, Gen X, not
Yeah.
Gen
Right.
Z. Thank
Okay.
you. Gen X. Yep, thank you. Gen X, they are very skeptical. And so if you're a millennial who you largely came up in a pretty positive environment, at least in the United States, during your primary years, then you may be eager or excited to work on a project, and you may have a Gen X counterpart who you may feel is negative, but in reality, they're just skeptical,
Yep.
and their healthy skepticism is important. But if you surface those characteristics or approaches or have some trainings or conversations where you talk about it, then at least people won't take it personally. They'll say, "Oh no, Terry, Gen X Terry is like this. It's not personal. I don't have to change. That's just how they show up at work."
Yeah. Interesting.
And so there's a bunch of different examples of that. But essentially I talk about at the end of it all, you have to talk to people about how they want to be communicated to and what their preferences are. And you have to be able to get folks to shift from those external things that affect them. So generations, their family upbringing, things like that. And you have to get them into whatever your team or clubs or organization's culture is.
So is there is the onus on the leader to recognize that if I'm pairing Gen X Terry with Gen Z,
Gen Z Jill.
you're right, to understand you got this skeptical person with this the world is great and positive person
Yeah.
to educate them on each other, or is it
Yeah.
just make sure our culture allows different perspectives and outlooks? Like, tell me about what leaders approach to that specific
Yeah.
situation you talked about.
So yeah, so there are a couple of things. So the first thing is everybody's responsibilities.
Yeah.
We have a great podcast episode and there's a great YouTube video on leadership and the tango. And in it they show a couple of examples where if one person moves, if the follower, like the person who's supposed to be the follower in a tango dance, if they try to lead, how it there's a lot of like visual discord.
Okay.
And so the ultimate is the leader and the follower are working together. So the onus is on everybody in that space. Training and assessments are designed to surface those things so that you then have a better understanding of how the other person works. The challenge with training is there's a natural bias towards leadership training. So as soon as your boss says, we're going to have this workshop, people check out because of certain phrases
Yeah.
that are used. Jargon automatically makes somebody check out. So if you think about in media interviews, when someone says no comment, instantly makes you check out. That's our brain. That's a brain function. That's not anything we have to override it intentionally.
Yep.
So whenever you hear your boss say, we're going to do this training, it's like, oh God, I don't want to do this. The other part is people like how they feel about assessments, but there's probably 350 leadership assessments you can take, and people just go with the one they like and had a good experience with. And what they don't understand is a lot of leadership assessments are instruments that measure certain behaviors or certain things, and they're not just kind of we're choosing between two brands. It's we're choosing between what we want our outcome to be. And so I feel like those two things have to shift everywhere. It's not just in sports, but everywhere. And so as a leader, you have to be intentional about how are you choosing those things. If I'm leading,
Well,
we're doing community service or we're doing a hackathon. And what you'll find is between those two, people will have conversations about themselves and how they work. And in trying to solve that problem in hackathons, you'll see exactly how people think. And if you can find a hackathon structure that works and use it as a team building activity, then you surface those conversations. You have action paired with it so that people believe when you're in a meeting down the line trying to talk about something, they know how you are because they can think about how you made peanut butter and jelly sandwiches during the community service, or in the hackathon, were you loud and boisterous? Were you quiet and observant? How did you move? And so for me, it feels like it's leaders and followers, but also leaders have to find the activities and assessment that match what they're trying to shift in their culture.
When you say a hackathon, is that like a case study, or tell me what you mean by hackathon?
Oh, so hackathons are fun. So
Yeah.
hackathons are like unconferences.
Yeah.
You bring in people who have experience or education related to a problem, and you put them in that room and you give them a problem to solve in a day. So for example, if one of the issues is we have a problem managing NIL at Division One institutions in New Jersey. I'm from Jersey, so we'll pick Jersey. Then I might bring in some marketing people, some people who have lived in Jersey their whole life, some people from New Jersey government, some financial advisors, all these people that might be related to this, and then walk through a structure of how do we move from problem to testable solutions that we can generate.
And that allows, from your experience or what you're saying, is that will allow people to see how each other work on something that's not work related, but you still can see how working with this person could be. So later on down the line,
Mhm.
you'll remember that when this came up, this person,
Yeah.
that type of thing.
It could be, like, related to their work, but it's
Okay.
not something they need to do their job.
So essentially, you said the responsibilities, in my mind, this is what I heard, my interpretation. Responsibilities have to be well defined. So lead and follow is, you know, who's in charge and who's not, or what people's role is in this.
Yeah,
You know, the big picture is made up of smaller pictures. So everybody
yeah,
knows what their role is. And
yeah,
then as a leader, you do want to create some type of way of helping people know how each other work on
yes,
different things
yes,
under different pressures and stuff like that.
yes, yes, and once you remove the stereotypes,
Right.
just kind of in every block, and just really focus on getting to know that person, it makes it easier to manage. So you say, instead of saying, Gen Z Jill, it's just Jill,
Yeah.
and here's kind of who she is.
Yeah. I love that. Now, tell me how you take everything we've talked about, right? Sport media, PR, leadership, the things about leadership, culture, the four things you mentioned, and the biases that people tie to generational workforce. Tell me how that all comes together when you're coaching somebody. Like if you're coaching an NFL executive, or you're coaching somebody who's incorporated and is about to get this job of where they're the CEO or the head coach or the general manager, and they need to know how to communicate their own value, or they need to know
Yeah.
how they can talk when they're sitting down at this table with all the other executives in the company. Tell me a little bit how everything ties together.
Wow, that's a tough one. For me, coaching is a shift in that I know the process and the tools, but I don't always have to know the content. And so in my coaching, it's like 80% coaching and probably 20% teaching, just because that I'm a natural. I come from a generations of education and
Well,
entrepreneurs.
let me
So
say this real quick. I don't necessarily mean the teaching part. I'm talking about in your mind as you're processing how you're helping somebody and asking them questions. Tell
yeah.
me how it comes together in your mind, not necessarily
Oh.
what you see what I mean?
I do. So it's hard
Yeah.
because I feel like sometimes I have an answer and I can give them that, and that's not what coaching is. It's guiding them to that answer. So for me, I have to kind of push some of this down
Okay.
until there's an opportunity for it to come up. So for example, I had a client I was working with and he had to give a speech at his high school. And in my mind, I had the three things he could talk about. I had the three things, I had the three stories he had told me, and I had the structure for him to do it. But I had to give that 30 minutes to help him process and make sure, is that your story? Is that what you want to say? Do you want these things, or is there something else that's coming up?
Okay.
And so for me, it's hard because I feel like I can give that answer immediately. But what's beautiful about the coaching practice, and what's nice, is some different things come up and people feel ownership over that
Yeah.
process. So
Do you
I have to shift.
right? Do you feel like the things you've seen, because I if you could, let me just ask this side question. If you could tell me how many coaching sessions you had in general that you've had over the last, you've been doing it for 5 or 6 years
Yeah,
officially, and you probably did a little bit
gosh.
of it, that wasn't official before
Yeah,
that. So,
yeah.
so hundreds, let's just say hundreds maybe.
Wow.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I've been a strength-based coach
Right.
for like since
There
2008,
you
so
go.
almost
All
20
right.
years. And then in the last 5 plus with stretch, if I went into our Monday, I could tell you exactly how many hours,
Right.
which has been hundreds. That's a tough question. I
So,
don't know if I can
but
give you
just
a satisfactory
the point
answer.
is that just to say it's a lot, right?
Yes.
So I think what I want to know is all the things we've talked about and the people you're coaching, most of them of those hundreds or thousands are probably in some type of leadership position, have been or will be.
Mhm,
Do you
mhm.
see all these things coming together, right? If you were to write this book about what you've seen, your perspective on people and leadership, do you see all the things we've talked about and how it all ties together coming together? Because this is, to me, sounds like it's all in your brain and there's got to be some overlap in all these things, right?
Yes, I do see it coming together. I
Okay.
do. It's just in coaching, I can't just jump right in
You
and
can't just
say
tell
it.
them, yeah.
Teaching is becoming that same way. So what I mostly teach 18 to 25-year-olds, although I do teach graduate classes. Once a year, I teach an online graduate class of students who are probably 24 to 70.
Yeah.
So I do get some of that experience. But what I'm finding with younger people is I lean more into coaching habits and skills before I jump into some of the
Oh,
teaching
yeah.
habits that I've taught. But yeah, I do see it coming together. It just and every person it looks different, and some people it takes longer to get. Like I had one client who he's probably Gen X, maybe older Gen X. And he was kind of making these age jokes. And, and I said to him, I said, well, if they're young, you're old. And I know that that's not what you're trying to do.
Right.
And so sometimes I can lean in and just kind of say it. But I feel like there's definitely some shifts that need to happen. You told me not to curse, so I want to make sure people know it's
That's
SHIFTS
hilarious. Right.
shifts. Um, there's some shifts that need to happen.
Yeah, so
So
that leads me to my final question, which is looking at all those interviews, all you've learned from 50,000 feet, are there some trends that you see in terms of shifts when you talk about where leadership is going or what you have seen over
yeah.
the last 20 to 25 years in terms of what you've learned, what you've coached, what you
Yeah.
see based on an information you have and your perspectives of things?
The biggest thing I can say is there's relief after you push through resistance.
Okay.
So some of the leaders so there's a great book, Motivating Age 10 to 25. And one of the concepts that I love in the beginning of the book is they share that the more experienced the leader is, the more likely they're going to reuse strategies that they've used before, even if the data shows the strategy isn't going to work.
Right.
But I'm used to this. I'm comfortable with this process, and I don't want to take the risk that's on the other side of this. And what I find is, and through coaching and a little bit of teaching, is once you have somebody that's walking with you through the risk, once you stop resisting and get to that other side, there's relief.
Okay.
So I think about like myself, like I criticized our sport media proposal, not criticized, but I gave a lot of feedback. And I felt we were missing some core things. And even then, I still made a mistake with one of the classes. And I could have said, no, we're going to stick with this. We're going to stay with this class. But I had conversations across the board with the teacher of the course, the department,
Right.
students, some other folks in the industry. And I said, okay, after year one, we can let this class go and we can put a better class in that place. And I feel like sometimes as leaders, they're resisting whatever that is because they don't want to be wrong, or they don't want to take a risk. And there's relief on the other side of that resistance. Either you're proved right or your change works and you can really address the problem because the problems are never going to stop. But if you're building up resistance to all of these things,
Yeah.
like you're going to be like stressful and anxietal.
Yeah. I like that relief on the other side of resistance. That applies beyond leadership too, right? I think that's excellent. Well, Dr. Bullock, this has been an excellent conversation, and I really appreciate you joining us here on the One Question Leadership podcast.
Thank you, Ty. I appreciate this conversation.
Yes, ma'am. That was Dr. Lauren Bullock. She's a professor at Temple where she teaches leadership, public relations, and sport media. She also is on the team at Stretch, leadership communications and career coach, and of course, a good friend of mine and all of us here at the One Question Leadership podcast. And of course, this is Ty Brown with One Question. And keep in mind, The role of a leader is to create and maintain an environment that people want to be a part of. And as always, be better tomorrow than you are today. This episode of the One Question Leadership Podcast is produced by Spades Media Group, solving problems using creative leadership.